The woman who never spoke walked into Pyramid City on a Tuesday morning in July of 1882. Her dress covered in dust, so thick it looked like she had crossed the entire Nevada desert on foot. And in the silence that followed her arrival, every man in town felt something stir in his chest that he could not name. She moved through the main street with her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the horizon, past the saloon and the general store and the livery stable, as though the buildings and people around her existed in a different world entirely. The shopkeeper tipped his hat and got nothing. The banker called out a greeting and received only the sight of her back. Even old Samuel Preston, who had charmed every woman from Carson City to Virginia City, found himself standing with his mouth half open as she passed him without so much as a glance. Evelyn Taylor, as the town would eventually learn her name, took a room above the seamstress shop where Mrs. Henderson worked. The older woman had been the only one to approach her with nothing more than a gentle gesture toward the stairs and a key pressed into her palm. No questions asked. No conversation required. It was Mrs. Henderson who told the townspeople what little she knew, which was precious little indeed. The girl was young, perhaps 22 or 23, and she had coin enough to pay for 3 months in advance. Beyond that, silence. The men of Pyramid City were not accustomed to being ignored. In a town where women were scarce and loneliness ran as deep as the silver mines in the hills, a new female arrival typically meant courting and competition. But Evelyn Taylor would not even meet their eyes. She walked to the general store twice a week, made her purchases with written notes and exact change, and returned to her room above the seamstress shop like a ghost ascending to some unreachable realm. Thomas Cole had been watching her for 3 weeks before he made his first move, though move would have been far too generous a word for what he did. He simply stood at the hitching post outside the general store one morning, holding the door of his horse's saddlebag, and when she approached on her way inside, he gave her a single slight nod. Nothing more. No smile, no words, no expectation written across his face. Just acknowledgement, one human being to another. She paused. It was barely perceptible, a hitch in her step that lasted perhaps half a second, but Thomas saw it. Then she continued past him into the store, and he went back to checking his supplies as though nothing had happened at all. Thomas Cole was not like the other men in town. He worked a small ranch 5 miles outside Pyramid City, running cattle on land that his father had claimed and his mother had civilized before fever took them both in the winter of 1877. At 26, he had the weathered look of someone who had learned early that survival meant hard work and silence, that the desert respected action more than words. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of creek water after rain. The women in town had tried their luck with him over the years, but he had remained stubbornly unattached, married more to his land and his cattle than to any person. There was something about Evelyn Taylor that pulled at him, though. Not just her beauty, which was undeniable even beneath the armor of her silence, but the weight she carried. He recognized it because he carried his own. Grief, maybe, or fear, or some combination of the two that had carved out a hollow place inside her chest where words used to live. The second time he saw her, a week later, he was loading feed bags onto his wagon outside the mill. She walked past on the other side of the street, her arms full of fabric from Mrs. Henderson's shop. He caught her eye for just a moment and gave her the same simple nod. This time, something flickered across her face. Not quite recognition, but not complete dismissal either. Progress, in its smallest form. The town gossip about Evelyn had reached a fever pitch by late August. Ruby Martinez, who ran the saloon, claimed she must be running from a husband. Deputy Frank Morrison speculated she was a widow struck mute by tragedy. The more romantic souls suggested a broken heart, though that seemed too simple for the kind of silence she wore. Thomas heard all of it and ignored all of it. Whatever her story was, it belonged to her until she decided otherwise. His third nod came at the church social, which Thomas attended only because Mrs. Henderson had specifically requested his presence to help move tables. Evelyn was there too, sitting alone on the edge of the gathering while the rest of the town ate and laughed and danced to fiddle music. Thomas carried a table past her, and when she glanced up, he gave her the now familiar nod. She looked away quickly, but he saw the corners of her mouth shift. Not quite a smile, but something softer than the rigid blankness she showed everyone else. It was Deputy Morrison who finally pushed Thomas to do more than nod. "You are wasting your time with that one, Cole," the deputy said one evening at the saloon, bourbon making him bolder than usual. "She is broken. Whatever happened to her, it broke her completely. A woman like that is not meant for a man who wants a real life." Thomas set down his beer with more force than necessary. "And what would you know about what she is meant for? I know she has not spoken a single word in 3 months. Not one. That is not normal, Cole. That is not right. Maybe she has not found anyone worth speaking to yet." The words came out harder than Thomas intended, and Morrison raised his hands in mock surrender. But the exchange stuck with Thomas as he rode home that night under a sky so full of stars, it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. Morrison was wrong. Evelyn was not broken. She was protected, guarded, wrapped in silence like armor because something or someone had taught her that words were dangerous. The fourth nod happened at the general store again, but this time Thomas had brought something with him. When Evelyn approached the counter with her basket, she found a small bundle waiting there, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. She looked at Mr. Peterson, the store owner, who shrugged and pointed at Thomas standing near the window. Thomas did not approach her. He just met her eyes and nodded toward the package. After a long moment, she picked it up and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a book, worn but well kept, the cover embossed with gold lettering that read Poems of Emily Dickinson. Evelyn stared at the book for so long that Mr. Peterson started to fidget uncomfortably. Then she looked up at Thomas with an expression he could not quite read. He had chosen the book carefully, remembering how he had seen her eyes linger on the poetry section during her previous visits to the store. He had not written his name inside, had not included a note. The gift was meant to speak for itself. "I see you. I pay attention. I ask for nothing in return." She held the book against her chest and gave him a nod of her own. Small, quick, but unmistakable. Thomas felt something warm spread through his chest, and he returned the nod before walking out of the store, leaving her to her shopping. The pattern continued through September and into October. Thomas would see her in town and offer his quiet acknowledgement. Sometimes she would nod back. Sometimes she would not. He never pushed, never tried to force conversation or proximity. The other men in town had given up their pursuit, declaring her too strange or too damaged to bother with. But Thomas understood that trust was not something demanded or earned through grand gestures. It was built one small moment at a time, one nod at a time, until the distance between two people became something crossable. The day everything shifted was October 15th, and it started with a rattlesnake. Thomas had been riding back from checking his fence line when he saw Evelyn walking along the road that led out of town. She was farther from Pyramid City than he had ever seen her venture, a good 2 miles out, and she was not moving with her usual purposeful stride. Instead, she stood completely frozen about 10 feet from where a massive diamondback had coiled itself directly across the path. its rattle singing a warning that carried clear across the desert air. Thomas dismounted slowly, careful not to spook either the snake or Evelyn. She turned her head slightly at the sound of his boots on the hard ground, and he saw something in her face that made his chest tighten. Pure, undiluted fear, not just of the snake, but of everything, of the whole world and every danger it contained. He moved to stand between her and the rattler, putting himself in the more vulnerable position without thinking twice about it. The snake watched him with cold eyes, its tongue flicking out to taste the air. Thomas had killed more rattlesnakes than he could count over the years, but killing this one would require getting closer, and that meant potentially putting Evelyn at risk if the snake struck. Instead, he did what his father had taught him years ago. He stood very still, made himself as boring and unthreatening as possible, and waited. The snake, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, slowly uncoiled and slithered off the path and into the rocks, apparently deciding they were not worth the effort. Thomas let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. When he turned to check on Evelyn, he found her looking at him with wide eyes, her hands trembling at her sides. Without thinking, he reached out and touched her shoulder gently, just enough to ground her, to remind her she was safe. She did not pull away. They stood like that for a moment, his hand on her shoulder and her eyes locked on his, and Thomas saw something crack in her careful armor. Not break, but crack, like ice beginning to thaw. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, knowing she would not answer but needing to ask anyway. She nodded, and this time it was different from all the other nods they had exchanged. This one was personal, intimate, an answer meant specifically for him. He withdrew his hand slowly and gestured to his horse. "Can I give you a ride back to town? That is a long walk, and the sun will be setting soon." For a moment, he thought she would refuse. But then she moved toward the horse with careful steps, and Thomas helped her up into the saddle before mounting behind her. They rode slowly, Thomas keeping his arms carefully positioned to hold the reins without crowding her, and she sat stiffly at first before gradually relaxing against the rhythm of the horse's gait. He could feel her breathing, could smell the lavender soap she used, and something about the quiet intimacy of the ride made his heart beat faster in his chest. They did not speak, did not need to, and when they reached the edge of town, Thomas helped her down with the same gentle care he had used to help her up. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something that made his breath catch. She placed her hand over his heart, just for a second, before turning and walking toward her room above the seamstress shop. Thomas stood there watching her go, his hand coming up to touch the spot where her palm had rested, and he knew with absolute certainty that whatever was growing between them was not something he could walk away from. The next morning, he found a note slipped under the door of his ranch house. The handwriting was elegant, each letter carefully formed, and the message was brief. "Thank you for yesterday. E.T." It was the first communication she had initiated with anyone in Pyramid City, and Thomas kept that note in his shirt pocket like a talisman. Over the following weeks, their interactions became more frequent though no less quiet. Thomas made a habit of being in town on the days he knew she shopped. She made a habit of walking routes where she knew she might see him. They exchanged nods that became longer glances that became moments of shared presence, where neither felt the need to fill the silence with meaningless words. In early November, Thomas took a risk. He brought his guitar to town, something he rarely did, and sat on the bench outside the general store playing old songs his mother had taught him. He did not look to see if Evelyn was listening, but when he finished the third song, he found a cup of coffee sitting on the bench beside him, still steaming, and he knew she had brought it. The pattern repeated the next week, and the week after that. Thomas would play, and Evelyn would bring him coffee, and slowly, incrementally, she began to sit farther away at first, then closer, until finally she was sitting on the same bench, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. It was during one of these musical afternoons that trouble arrived in the form of Wade Harrison, a ranch hand from one of the bigger spreads north of town. Harrison had been drinking, and he had opinions about women who thought themselves too good to speak to decent men. "Hey there, pretty lady," Harrison called out, his words slurred and aggressive. "You too high and mighty to say hello to me." Evelyn went rigid and Thomas stopped playing mid-chord. "Leave her alone, Harrison," Thomas said quietly, setting his guitar aside carefully. "Or what, Cole? You going to protect your mute girlfriend? Maybe she is silent because she has nothing worth saying. Or maybe," Harrison leaned in, his smile cruel, "she is just waiting for a real man to give her something to talk about." Thomas was on his feet before Harrison finished the sentence. He was not a violent man by nature, but the threatening tone in Harrison's voice and the way Evelyn had shrunk back against the wall triggered something primal in his chest. "Walk away," Thomas said, his voice deadly calm. "Right now." Harrison was bigger than Thomas, broader through the shoulders and carrying at least 20 extra pounds, but there was something in Thomas's eyes that made the bigger man hesitate. Deputy Morrison, who had been watching from across the street, started walking their direction with purpose. "We have got a problem here, gentlemen," Morrison asked, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "No problem," Harrison said, raising his hands in mock innocence. "Just trying to be friendly to the lady. Not my fault she is touched in the head." Thomas moved before he could think better of it, but Morrison caught his arm. "He is not worth it, Cole," the deputy said quietly, "and she does not need to see you hauled off to jail for disturbing the peace." Thomas looked at Evelyn, saw the fear in her eyes mixing with something else, something that looked almost like gratitude, and forced himself to step back. Harrison laughed and stumbled away toward the saloon, and Morrison gave Thomas a meaningful look before following to make sure the drunk ranch hand did not cause more trouble. Thomas turned to Evelyn, his hands shaking with residual adrenaline. "I am sorry about that. Are you all right?" She nodded, but she was trembling. Without thinking, Thomas reached for her hand and she let him take it. Her fingers were cold despite the afternoon warmth, and he held them gently, trying to will warmth and safety back into her through sheer force of intention. "He cannot hurt you," Thomas said softly. "I will not let anyone hurt you." She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes. She opened her mouth as though to speak, and Thomas held his breath, but no words came out. Instead, she squeezed his hand tightly, so tightly it almost hurt, and he squeezed back with equal pressure. They stood like that until the sun began to set, hand in hand on the street in Pyramid City. And when she finally withdrew her fingers from his, Thomas felt the loss like a physical ache. That night, another note appeared under his door. "You make me feel safe. I have not felt safe in a very long time." Thomas read those words at least a dozen times before carefully folding the paper and adding it to the first note in his shirt pocket. November brought colder weather to the Nevada desert, and with it came the first real test of whatever was building between Thomas and Evelyn. Mrs. Henderson fell ill with pneumonia, and the seamstress shop closed for nearly 3 weeks while she recovered. Evelyn, who had been helping with the sewing in exchange for her rent, found herself with nowhere to stay and no work to pay for alternative lodging. It was Deputy Morrison who brought Thomas the news, riding out to the ranch on a gray afternoon with worry etched into his face. "She is going to have to leave town if she cannot find somewhere to stay," Morrison said, accepting the coffee Thomas offered. Ruby Martinez offered her a room at the saloon, but the girl looked like she would rather sleep in the street. And you know what Ruby would expect her to do to earn that room. Thomas knew exactly what Ruby would expect. Working in the saloon was the only job available to most women in towns like Pyramid City, and it was not the kind of work Evelyn was suited for. It was not the kind of work he could bear to imagine her doing. She could stay here, Thomas said before he fully thought it through. Morrison raised an eyebrow. At your ranch, alone with you, Cole, that would destroy what little reputation she has left. She could have the main house. I will sleep in the barn. It is warm enough, and I have done it before during calving season. Mrs. Chen can come out from town to act as chaperone during the days. Mrs. Chen was the laundress, a stern, older Chinese woman who had survived more hardship than most people could imagine, and who would not tolerate any impropriety under her watch. Morrison studied Thomas for a long moment. You are serious about her? It was not a question, but Thomas answered anyway. Yes, she still has not spoken to anyone. Not one word, Cole. Do you even know what happened to her? What she is running from? No, Thomas admitted. But it does not matter. Whatever it was, she survived it. She is still here, still fighting to build a life even though something tried to break her. That tells me everything I need to know about who she is. Morrison shook his head slowly, but he was almost smiling. You are either the bravest man I know or the biggest fool. Maybe both. I will talk to her about your offer, but do not be surprised if she says no. Trust is one thing. Living on a man's property is something else entirely. But Evelyn said yes. She arrived at the ranch 2 days later in a wagon driven by Mrs. Chen, who looked at Thomas with such fierce protectiveness that he felt like he was being sized up by a mother bear guarding her cub. Evelyn carried a single bag containing all her possessions, and she stood in the yard of Thomas's ranch looking uncertain and small against the vast emptiness of the desert landscape. Thomas showed her the house, explaining that it had 2 rooms, one that had belonged to his parents and one that had been his. She would take his parents' room, which had a better bed and a window that faced east to catch the morning light. He had already moved his things to the barn and set up a cot near the tack room where the small stove would keep him warm enough through the winter nights. Mrs. Chen inspected everything with a critical eye before declaring the arrangements acceptable. She would come to the ranch each day at dawn and leave at dusk. She informed Thomas, and if she heard so much as a whisper of impropriety, she would personally ensure that certain parts of his anatomy were separated from his body. Thomas believed her completely. The first few days were awkward. Evelyn moved through the house like a ghost, careful not to disturb anything, while Thomas tried to maintain his normal routine of checking cattle, mending fences, and hauling water. They saw each other at meals, which Mrs. Chen prepared with ruthless efficiency, but conversation was impossible with Evelyn's silence, and Thomas found himself talking more to Mrs. Chen about ranch matters than he had talked to anyone in months. But gradually, things shifted. Evelyn began leaving the house to watch Thomas work. She would sit on the porch wrapped in one of his mother's old shawls and observe as he trained a young horse or repaired a saddle. Her presence was quiet but constant, and Thomas found himself working with more care, more attention to detail, aware of her eyes following his movements. One afternoon in late November, he was struggling to lift a heavy beam that had fallen from the barn roof during a windstorm. He had it halfway up when he felt additional weight bearing on the other end, and he looked over to find Evelyn straining to help him lift. Together, they got the beam back into position, and when Thomas turned to thank her, she was smiling. Actually smiling, wide and genuine, and the sight of it nearly knocked him over more effectively than any falling beam could have. "You have a beautiful smile," he said without thinking, and immediately worried he had overstepped. But her smile only grew wider, and she ducked her head in what might have been embarrassment or pleasure or both. That night, she cooked dinner for the first time, shooing Mrs. Chen away with gentle insistence. The older woman looked at Thomas with raised eyebrows but allowed herself to be dismissed early. Evelyn made stew from salt pork and vegetables. Nothing fancy. But when Thomas sat down to eat and found her sitting across from him at the small table, the simple meal felt like the finest feast he had ever attended. They ate in comfortable silence, and afterward, Evelyn brought out the book of poetry he had given her months ago. She set it on the table between them and opened it to a page she had marked with a ribbon, then turned the book so Thomas could read. The poem was "Wild Nights, Wild Nights," and Thomas read it slowly, aware of the weight of her choice. The poem spoke of longing, of finding harbor in another person, of the deep contentment that came from being exactly where you were meant to be. When he looked up, Evelyn was watching him with an intensity that made his mouth go dry. He wanted to reach across the table and take her hand, wanted to tell her that he thought about her constantly, that she had become the center around which his entire world revolved. But he settled for a nod and a small smile, and she returned both before carefully closing the book. Progress, he reminded himself. Trust built one quiet moment at a time. December brought the first real cold, and with it came challenges that forced Thomas and Evelyn into closer quarters. A storm rolled in from the north, dropping temperatures and bringing wind that howled through every crack and crevice. Mrs. Chen sent word that she could not make it out to the ranch while the roads were frozen, and Thomas found himself alone with Evelyn for the first time since she arrived. He had been checking on the cattle, making sure they had access to the windbreak he had built and that their water had not frozen solid, and when he returned to the house, he was half frozen himself. His coat was crusted with ice, his fingers numb despite his gloves, and his teeth were chattering so hard he could barely get the door open. Evelyn took one look at him and sprang into action. She pushed him toward the fire, stripped off his frozen coat, and wrapped him in every blanket in the house. Then she made hot coffee and literally held the cup to his lips until he could feel his fingers enough to hold it himself. "I am all right," Thomas tried to say, but it came out as more of a mumble through his still chattering teeth. Evelyn shook her head firmly and disappeared into the bedroom, returning with more blankets and one of his mother's old quilts. She wrapped him up until he looked like some kind of cloth cocoon, and then she did something that made his heart stop. She sat down beside him and put her arms around him, adding her own warmth to the layers of fabric. Thomas froze, but not from the cold. He could feel her pressed against his side, could feel her breath on his neck, and it took every ounce of willpower he possessed not to turn and pull her fully into his arms. "Evelyn," he said softly, "you do not have to do this." She pulled back just enough to look at him, and then she shook her head and hugged him tighter. She was choosing this, he realized. Choosing to offer comfort, choosing to be close to him, and the gift of that choice was more valuable than anything he had ever been given. They sat like that until Thomas finally stopped shivering and the feeling returned to his extremities. The storm raged outside, but inside the small house, wrapped in blankets and Evelyn's arms, Thomas felt safer and more content than he had felt since before his parents died. When the storm finally broke 3 days later, something between them had fundamentally changed. The careful distance they had maintained was gone, replaced by a comfortable closeness that felt as natural as breathing. Evelyn touched him now, small casual contacts that she initiated. A hand on his arm to get his attention, her shoulder brushing his as they washed dishes together, her fingers straightening his collar before he went out to work in the cold. "Mrs. Chen noticed immediately when she returned, and she watched them with sharp eyes for several days before apparently deciding that whatever was happening met with her approval. She even smiled when she caught Evelyn laughing soundlessly at something Thomas said, a sight so rare that Thomas nearly dropped the bucket he was carrying. Christmas approached, and Thomas wanted to give Evelyn something meaningful, something that would show her how much she had come to mean to him. He spent weeks working on it in secret, carving during the hours after she had gone to bed and hiding his project in the barn. On Christmas morning, he presented her with a small wooden box, every surface carved with intricate designs of the desert, wildflowers, and birds in flight. Inside, lined with soft fabric he had bought from Mrs. Henderson, was a blank journal and a beautiful pen. Evelyn opened the box and stared at the contents for so long that Thomas started to worry he had miscalculated. But then she looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, and she threw her arms around his neck and held him like she would never let go. Thomas wrapped his arms around her waist and held her just as tightly, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his chest. When she finally pulled back, she was still crying, but she was also smiling, and she pressed her hand to his cheek with such tenderness that Thomas felt his own eyes grow damp. She took the journal and pen and sat down at the table, and Thomas watched as she opened to the first page and began to write. Her hand moved quickly, filling line after line, and when she finally stopped and turned the journal toward him, Thomas read words that made his breath catch. "My name is Evelyn Rose Taylor. I was born in St. Louis in 1860. I came west with my husband in 1880, and for 2 years he hurt me in ways I cannot yet write about. He told me that my voice, my words, my thoughts were worthless. He told me that if I spoke, he would make me regret it. So I stopped speaking. I stopped using the part of me he had turned into a weapon against me. When he died in a mining accident last year, I should have felt free, but I did not know how to use my voice anymore. I had forgotten what it was for." She paused, letting Thomas finish reading, and then she turned the page and continued writing. "Then I met you. You who never demanded words. You who saw me and acknowledged me without needing me to perform or explain or justify my existence. You who taught me that silence could be a choice instead of a prison. You who made me want to speak again, not because I have to, but because I want to share myself with you. Thomas Cole, you gave me back my voice by never insisting I use it. And now I want to tell you something I should have said months ago." She set down the pen and looked at him, and when she opened her mouth, sound came out for the first time since she arrived in Pyramid City. Her voice was rough from disuse, barely more than a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound Thomas had ever heard. "I love you," Evelyn said, each word careful and deliberate. "I love you, Thomas Cole." Thomas felt something break open in his chest, some dam he had been holding against the full force of his feelings, and he reached for her with shaking hands. "I love you too," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. "God, Evelyn, I love you so much." And then he kissed her, soft and gentle and full of all the things he had been too afraid to say. And she kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair and her tears mixing with his. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Evelyn laughed, and the sound was like music, like spring rain on the desert, like everything good and true in the world. "Say it again," Thomas whispered, touching his forehead to hers. "I love you," Evelyn said, stronger this time, her voice gaining confidence with each word. "I love you, I love you, I love you, Mrs." Chen found them like that an hour later, wrapped in each other's arms and whispering confessions of love, and she cleared her throat so loudly they jumped apart like guilty children. "About time," the older woman said, but she was smiling. "Now, Mr. Cole, I believe you have some courting to do properly. And Miss Taylor, I believe you have a voice that needs to be introduced to the town." Evelyn's return to speaking was not immediate or easy. There were days when the words would not come, when fear or memory locked her throat tight. But Thomas was patient, always patient, and he held her through the difficult moments and celebrated the small victories when she managed to say good morning or thank you or I am happy. By the time spring arrived in 1883, Evelyn was speaking regularly, though still quietly, and the town of Pyramid City had grown accustomed to the sound of her voice at the general store or the church, or walking down the street hand in hand with Thomas Cole. They were married in April, on a warm day when wildflowers bloomed across the desert, and the sky was so blue it hurt to look at it. Deputy Morrison stood up as Thomas's best man, and Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Chen flanked Evelyn as her attendants. The ceremony was small and simple, held in the church with most of the town in attendance, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was witnessed by a community that had watched their love story unfold, one quiet nod at a time. Evelyn moved her few possessions from the bedroom that had been his parents' to the one that Thomas had reclaimed, and on their wedding night, she told him the full story of what had happened to her. He listened without interruption as she described her first husband's cruelty, the systematic way he had broken down her sense of self, and the guilty relief she felt when the mine collapse took his life. "I thought I would never be able to trust a man again," Evelyn whispered in the darkness, her head resting on Thomas's chest. "I thought whatever part of me that could love had died with my voice. But you were so patient. You never pushed or demanded. You just kept showing up, kept acknowledging me until I remembered that I was a person worth acknowledging." Thomas held her tighter, pressing a kiss to her hair. "You were always worth it, Evelyn. Always. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never forget that." They made love for the first time that night, gentle and slow, and Evelyn cried again. But this time from joy, from the overwhelming relief of being touched with tenderness instead of anger. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were good. Thomas expanded his ranch with Evelyn's help, and she proved to have a natural talent for managing the business side of cattle ranching. Her careful record-keeping and attention to detail turned their small operation into one of the most successful in the region. In the fall of 1884, Evelyn gave birth to their first child, a boy they named Theodore, with dark hair like his father and his mother's expressive eyes. Thomas held his son with shaking hands and looked at Evelyn with such overwhelming love that she started crying all over again. "Thank you," Thomas said, kissing her sweat-dampened forehead. "Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for this." "Thank you for waiting," Evelyn replied, her voice still hoarse from labor. "Thank you for seeing me when I could not see myself." Theodore was followed by a daughter named Caroline in 1886, and then another son, James, in 1888. The ranch house that had once been quiet and lonely was now filled with the sounds of children laughing and playing, of Evelyn singing lullabies, of Thomas reading stories before bedtime. Deputy Morrison married Ruby Martinez in a scandal that shocked the town, but surprised no one who actually knew them, and the former saloon owner transformed herself into a respectable businesswoman who ran the most successful hotel in Pyramid City. Mrs. Henderson recovered from her pneumonia and continued her seamstress work for another 15 years before retiring to live with her daughter in California. Mrs. Chen remained a fierce presence in their lives, adopting the role of grandmother to Thomas and Evelyn's children with the same protective intensity she had once applied to chaperoning their courtship. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Evelyn back to the spot where he had first nodded to her outside the general store. The building had been expanded, the town had grown, but the hitching post was still there, weathered by time and use. "You remember?" Thomas asked, taking her hand. "Every detail," Evelyn said, smiling up at him. "I remember thinking you were different from the other men. You looked at me, but you did not leer. You acknowledged me, but you did not demand anything." That first nod felt like the first time someone had treated me like a human being instead of an object in almost 3 years. "I fell in love with you that day," Thomas confessed. "I did not know it yet, but something in me recognized something in you, like calling to like." "Broken calling to broken," Evelyn said softly. "No," Thomas shook his head firmly. "Healing calling to healing. We were both healing, Evelyn. We just did it together instead of alone." She stood on her toes and kissed him, there in the middle of the main street of Pyramid City, Nevada, and when they broke apart, she was laughing. "Take me home, Cowboy," she said, using the nickname she had given him years ago, and Thomas swept her up in his arms and carried her to their wagon while she shrieked with delighted laughter. They drove home to their ranch as the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and pink, and their children ran out to meet them, shouting greetings and demanding to know what presents they had brought from town. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Thomas and Evelyn sat on their porch and watched the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Evelyn was writing in a new journal, her 5th since Christmas of 1882, documenting their life together with the same careful detail she brought to everything. "What are you writing about?" Thomas asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Today," Evelyn said. "Our anniversary, how lucky I am. How grateful I am that I walked into Pyramid City on that Tuesday morning in July. How my life truly began the day you first nodded to me." "My life began then too," Thomas said. "Everything before that was just waiting." Evelyn set down her pen and turned to kiss him. And in that moment, surrounded by the land they had built together and the family they had created, Thomas Cole knew that every difficult moment, every lonely night, every hardship he had endured had been worth it to arrive at this perfect present. The years continued to pass, marked by small joys and occasional sorrows. Theodore grew into a tall young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. Caroline developed her mother's head for business and her father's steady patience. James proved to be a natural horseman and had a gift for gentling even the most difficult animals. In 1895, when Evelyn was 35 and Thomas was 39, they welcomed a surprise 4th child, another daughter they named Grace. The pregnancy had been difficult, and there were moments when Thomas feared he might lose Evelyn, but she proved as strong as the desert itself, and Grace arrived healthy and squalling in the early hours of a March morning. "No more," the doctor said firmly, looking at Thomas with serious eyes. "Another pregnancy could kill her. Do you understand?" Thomas understood perfectly, and he held Evelyn a little tighter that night, grateful beyond words that she had survived, that she was still with him, that their family was complete. Grace was a late blessing, born when her siblings were old enough to help care for her, and she grew up adored and perhaps slightly spoiled by everyone who knew her. She had Evelyn's voice and Thomas's eyes, and from her earliest years, she showed a talent for singing that brought tears to her mother's eyes. "She has the voice I lost," Evelyn said one evening, listening to 7-year-old Grace sing a hymn in the church choir. "The voice I thought was gone forever. It just skipped a generation." Thomas squeezed her hand, understanding the bittersweet joy in her words. Evelyn had long since moved past the trauma of her first marriage, but there were still moments when echoes of that pain surfaced, and Thomas had learned to simply be present for her during those times, offering his solid, steady support without trying to fix or minimize her feelings. The turn of the century found the Cole family prosperous and respected throughout the region. Their ranch was one of the largest in Nevada, and Thomas had a reputation as a fair employer and an honest businessman. Evelyn had become active in town affairs, using her hard-won voice to advocate for women's rights and better education for children. She was particularly passionate about helping other women who had experienced abuse, offering them work and shelter, and the same patient support that Thomas had once offered her. In 1903, Theodore married a schoolteacher from Carson City, and in 1905, Caroline wed a young lawyer she had met while visiting family in San Francisco. James showed no interest in settling down, preferring to focus on breeding and training horses, but Grace, at 18, had attracted the attention of several young men in the area, much to Thomas's displeasure. "She is too young," Thomas grumbled one evening, watching yet another suitor arrive to call on his youngest daughter. "She is the same age I was when I married my first husband," Evelyn pointed out gently. "And while that marriage was a disaster, the problem was not my age. It was him." "Exactly," Thomas said. "How do we know these boys will not hurt her?" Evelyn took his face in her hands and made him look at her. "We taught her to value herself. We taught her to speak up when something is wrong. We taught her that she deserves kindness and respect. We gave her all the things I did not have, Thomas. We have to trust that she will make better choices than I did." Thomas knew she was right, but it did not make watching his baby girl grow up any easier. In the end, Grace chose a young doctor named Samuel, who treated her with the same patient respect that Thomas had always shown Evelyn. And Thomas gave his blessing even as his heart broke a little at the thought of her leaving their home. The wedding was held at the ranch in the summer of 1907, and as Thomas walked Grace down the makeshift aisle they had created in the yard, he looked over at Evelyn and saw tears streaming down her face. Happy tears, he knew, but also tears for all the years that had passed, for the children who had grown and the time that kept moving forward whether they were ready or not. That night, alone in their room for the first time in weeks after all the wedding guests had departed, Thomas pulled Evelyn into his arms and held her close. "We did well," he said softly. "Look at them. Look at what we built. 4 beautiful, kind, strong children, a good life, a good home." "We did well, Evelyn." "We did," she agreed, her voice muffled against his chest. "And we did it together. Every step, every challenge, every joy together." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity, bodies that knew each other as well as they knew themselves, and afterward they lay tangled together and talked about the future. "I want to travel," Evelyn said suddenly. "I want to see the ocean. I want to visit Caroline in San Francisco and Theodore in Sacramento. I want to experience the world beyond this desert." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. He had never been farther than Virginia City, had never had much interest in leaving the land he had worked so hard to build. But Evelyn had given up so much to be with him, had built her life around his dreams, and it was time he supported hers. "Then we will travel," he said. "James can manage the ranch. Caroline's husband has contacts that can help us plan a proper trip. We will see everything you want to see, Evelyn." "I promise." She turned in his arms to look at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight coming through the window. "Do you mean it?" "Every word," Thomas said, and kissed her to seal the promise. They spent the next year planning and preparing. And in the spring of 1908, Thomas and Evelyn Cole left Pyramid City for the first time together, beginning a journey that would take them to California, Oregon, and eventually all the way to New York City. Evelyn kept detailed journals of everything they saw and experienced, filling page after page with descriptions of the ocean, the tall buildings, the crush of humanity in the cities. Thomas found that he enjoyed traveling more than he expected, though he missed the wide open spaces of home. But watching Evelyn's face light up with wonder at each new sight made every moment of discomfort worth it. She was like a flower that had been kept in the shade, finally experiencing full sunlight, and Thomas felt honored to witness her bloom. They returned to Nevada in the fall, sunburned and exhausted and happy, with trunks full of gifts for their children and grandchildren. The ranch had run smoothly in their absence, and James greeted them with the news that he had negotiated an excellent contract for their cattle, and that they were likely to have their most profitable year yet. Life settled back into comfortable routines, but with a new layer of contentment. Thomas and Evelyn had proven to themselves that they could step outside their comfortable boundaries and survive, even thrive, and the knowledge gave them both a sense of confidence they had not possessed before. In 1912, on a warm evening in July, exactly 30 years after Evelyn had first walked into Pyramid City, Thomas took her hand and led her out to the porch where they had spent so many evenings together. "You remember what today is?" he asked. Evelyn smiled. "How could I forget? 30 years ago today, I arrived in this town thinking my life was over, thinking I would never speak again, never love again, never be anything more than a ghost moving through the world. And instead," Thomas prompted, "instead I found you. I found my voice. I found a family and a home and a life more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. All because a cowboy was patient enough to win my trust, one quiet nod at a time." Thomas pulled her into his arms and held her as the sun set over the desert they both loved. They were in their 50s now, gray threading through their hair and lines marking their faces, but the love between them was as strong as it had been on their wedding day, strengthened by decades of choosing each other every single day. "I would do it all again," Thomas said. "Every moment. Every nod. Every day of waiting and wondering if you would ever trust me. I would do it all again, Evelyn, because you are worth everything." "And you," Evelyn said, looking up at him with eyes still bright despite the passage of time, "are the best man I have ever known." "You saved my life, Thomas Cole. Not by riding in with guns blazing or making grand gestures, but by seeing me, truly seeing me, and accepting me exactly as I was. You gave me the space to heal and the courage to love again. That is a gift I can never fully repay." "You repay it every day," Thomas said. "Every time you smile at me, every time you speak my name, every time you choose to stay, that is all the repayment I need." They stood together on that porch as night fell completely and the stars emerged, the same stars that had witnessed their courtship all those years ago. Around them, the desert sang its evening song, cicadas and night birds calling to each other in the cooling air. Inside the house, the photographs they had collected over the years told the story of their life together. Wedding pictures and baby pictures, images of children growing and changing, family gatherings and celebrations. Each photograph was a moment frozen in time, a testament to the love and family they had built from the ashes of Evelyn's trauma and Thomas's loneliness. In 1915, the world beyond their desert home erupted into war, and though America would not officially enter the conflict for another 2 years, the Cole family felt the ripples. James enlisted despite his parents' protests, determined to serve his country, and Evelyn spent sleepless nights worrying about her son fighting in distant lands. Thomas held her through those dark nights, offering what comfort he could. And when James returned in 1919, bearing scars both visible and invisible, they welcomed him home with open arms and helped him heal just as they had once helped each other. The 1920s brought prosperity and change. Automobiles replaced horses on the streets of Pyramid City. The telephone lines reached their ranch, connecting them to the wider world in ways they had never imagined. Grace had 3 children of her own, and Caroline had 2, and Theodore had 4, and the Cole family gatherings required tables that seemed to stretch on forever. Evelyn, now in her 60s, was a grandmother many times over, and she adored each of her grandchildren with fierce devotion. She told them stories of the old days, of when their grandfather had won her heart with nothing but patience and kindness. And the children listened with wide eyes, unable to imagine a time when Grandma Evelyn had not spoken. In 1925, Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87, and Evelyn wept as though she had lost her own mother. In many ways, she had. Mrs. Chen had been a fierce protector and a wise advisor, and the world felt smaller without her presence. Thomas held Evelyn through her grief, just as she had held him through his own losses over the years. They had buried friends and family, had said goodbye to the deputy, and Ruby Martinez and Mrs. Henderson, and so many others who had been part of their story. Each loss left a mark, but it also deepened their appreciation for the time they had together. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1923, their children threw them a massive celebration. The whole town of Pyramid City turned out, along with friends and family from across the state. There were speeches and toasts and a dance that lasted well into the night, and Thomas and Evelyn stood at the center of it all, still holding hands after 4 decades of marriage. "How did you do it?" one of the younger couples asked them during the celebration. "How did you stay in love for so long?" Thomas looked at Evelyn, and she looked back at him, and they shared a smile that held 40 years of private jokes and shared sorrows and quiet moments of joy. "We chose each other," Evelyn said simply. "Every day, even on the hard days, we chose each other. And we never stopped talking, never stopped listening, never stopped trying to understand what the other person needed. And we built our love slowly," Thomas added. "We did not rush. We let it grow naturally at its own pace until it was strong enough to weather anything. Patience and persistence, that is the secret." The couple nodded thoughtfully, and Thomas and Evelyn returned to the dance floor, moving together with the ease of long practice, their bodies knowing instinctively how to move with each other. The Great Depression of the 1929 hit Nevada hard, but the Cole Ranch survived, partly due to Evelyn's careful financial management and partly due to the diversification they had implemented over the years. They raised cattle and horses, grew crops where they could, and when money was tight, they helped their neighbors however they could. Thomas was 73 in 1930, and his body was showing the signs of a lifetime of hard work. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, and his knees ached in the cold, but he still rose every morning and did what needed doing. Evelyn, at 69, was the same, her hair white now but her mind as sharp as ever. They spent more time sitting on their porch those days, watching the desert and talking about the life they had built. They reminisced about the early days, about the first nod and the first words and the first kiss. They talked about their children and grandchildren, marveling at how the quiet love that had bloomed between them had expanded to encompass so many people. In the spring of 1932, Thomas fell ill with pneumonia. The doctor was not optimistic, given his age and the severity of the infection, but Evelyn refused to accept that their time was ending. She nursed him with the same fierce determination she brought to everything, sitting by his bedside and reading to him from the poetry books he had given her over the years. "You are not allowed to leave me yet, Thomas Cole," she told him firmly when his fever was at its worst. "We still have too much life to live. We have more grandchildren to spoil and more sunsets to watch and more moments to share. You are not allowed to give up." Thomas, delirious with fever, smiled weakly. "Yes, madam," he whispered, and Evelyn burst into tears. But he survived, fighting his way back from the edge with the same stubborn determination that had characterized his entire life. By summer, he was back on his feet, though moving slower and tiring more easily than before. "You scared me," Evelyn said one evening as they sat on the porch, his hand clasped tightly in hers. "I scared myself," Thomas admitted. "I was not ready to go, Evelyn. I am still not ready. There is too much of you I have not finished loving yet." She laughed through her tears and kissed him gently. "Then we had better get to it, Cowboy. We are not getting any younger." They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1933 with a quiet dinner attended only by their immediate family. 50 years of marriage, 50 years of choosing each other, 50 years of building a life from the foundation of those first quiet nods. Thomas stood to give a toast, his voice shaking slightly with age and emotion. 50 years ago, I married the most remarkable woman I have ever known. She had been through hell and come out the other side, and she honored me by choosing to rebuild her life with me by her side. Evelyn, you have been my partner, my best friend, my greatest love. You have given me children and grandchildren, and a life so full of joy that sometimes I cannot believe it is real. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for every single day of the last 50 years. Evelyn was crying openly, and when Thomas sat back down, she stood and raised her own glass. "Thank you for waiting," she said, her voice still strong despite her years. "Thank you for seeing me when I could not see myself. Thank you for loving me when I thought I was unlovable. Thank you for being patient when I needed patience, and for pushing me when I needed pushing. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Thomas Cole, and I would choose you again in every lifetime." Their children applauded, their own eyes damp, and the family spent the rest of the evening sharing stories and laughter and love. Thomas and Evelyn lived several more years, watching the world change around them, watching their family grow and spread across the country. They saw the end of Prohibition and the beginning of World War II. They watched their grandchildren grow into adults and begin families of their own. On a quiet morning in October of 1938, Thomas woke to find Evelyn still sleeping beside him, and he spent a long moment just watching her in the early dawn light. She was 87 years old, her face lined with decades of laughter and sorrow, and she was still the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He thought about that first day he had seen her in Pyramid City, 56 years ago now, and how that first nod had changed the entire trajectory of his life. He thought about every moment between then and now, the quiet accumulation of days and years that had built into a lifetime of love. Evelyn stirred and opened her eyes, and when she saw him watching her, she smiled. "Good morning, my love," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning," Thomas replied, leaning in to kiss her forehead. "I love you." "I love you too," Evelyn said, as she had said thousands of times before and would say thousands of times again. They rose together and started their day, moving through routines perfected by decades of practice. Thomas made coffee while Evelyn prepared breakfast. They ate together at the table where they had shared so many meals, and they talked about their plans for the day, about the grandchildren who were coming to visit next week, about the repairs needed on the barn. It was an ordinary day, unremarkable in almost every way, but that was the beauty of it. After all the drama and trauma of their early years, after all the challenges they had faced and overcome, they had earned these ordinary days. They had earned the quiet contentment of a life well lived, a love well tended. That afternoon, they sat on their porch as they had done countless times before, watching the desert they both loved. Evelyn was writing in her journal, documenting the small details of their life, while Thomas simply held her hand and watched the clouds drift across the endless Nevada sky. "We did good, did we not?" Evelyn said suddenly, setting down her pen. "We did better than good," Thomas replied. "We did extraordinary." "Thank you," Evelyn said, squeezing his hand, "for everything, for seeing me, for waiting for me, for loving me, for building this beautiful life with me." "Thank you," Thomas echoed, "for trusting me, for choosing me, for giving me a family and a purpose, and a love that has defined my entire existence. You are everything, Evelyn. You always have been." They sat together as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting from the foundation of patience and trust. Around them, the desert sang its evening song, the same song it had sung for decades, and in that moment, Thomas and Evelyn Cole were completely, perfectly at peace. The years continued to pass gently. Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1941 at the age of 85, with Evelyn holding his hand, and their children gathered around them. His last words were, "I love you, Evelyn," and she whispered them back through her tears, grateful beyond measure that she had been able to tell him one last time. Evelyn lived 3 more years, spending that time with her children and grandchildren, telling stories of Thomas and their life together. She made sure everyone knew how he had saved her, how his patience and kindness had given her back her voice and her life. She wanted his legacy to live on, not just in the successful ranch and the family they had built, but in the example of how love should be: patient, kind, respectful, and enduring. She passed away quietly in her sleep in August of 1944 at the age of 93, and the family buried her next to Thomas on the hill overlooking their ranch. On her gravestone, beneath her name and dates, they inscribed the words she had asked for. She found her voice. She found her love. She found her home. The Cole family continued to grow and thrive, carrying forward the values Thomas and Evelyn had instilled in them. The ranch remained in the family for generations, a testament to what two broken people had built together through patience, trust, and unwavering love. And in Pyramid City, Nevada, old-timers still told the story of the woman who would not speak to any man in town and the cowboy who won her trust one quiet nod at a time. A love story that proved sometimes the quietest beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings.